adding on to where we left off last week. Last week we left off with the idea of how we have many reasons to love God, and we should love God. And tonight's lesson is going to be really an appreciation of God's love for us, in His faithfulness and in His being the true God, which we worship. A lot of thankfulness for God in these verses for Jeremiah here. But it's in Jeremiah 10, it's a sermon that Jeremiah was preaching against Judah for their idolatry, for their unfaithfulness to God. And it says here in our study that in Jeremiah 10, 3 through 16 is found an excellent comparison between the one true and living God and the lifeless idols and false gods of men. And so, to start out with here, I want to just read the whole section tonight so we have it in our minds as we talk about it a little bit. Well, we're starting in verse 3 of chapter 10. It said, "For the customs of the people are vain, for one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen, with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold, they fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good. For as much as there is none like unto thee, O Lord, thou art great, thy name is great in might. Who would not fear thee, O King of nations? For to thee doeth it appertain. For as much as among all the wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like unto thee. But they are altogether brutish and foolish. The stock is a doctrine of vanities. Silver spread into plates is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz. The work of the workman, and of the hands of the founder. Blue and purple is their clothing. They are all the work of cunning men. But the Lord is the true God. He is mighty, or He is the living God, and everlasting King. At His wrath the earth shall tremble, and the nations shall be able to abide His indignation. Thus shall ye say unto them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth, and from under these heavens. He hath made the earth by His power, He hath established the world by His wisdom, and hath stretched out the heavens by His discretion. When He utters His voice, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens, and He causeth the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightnings with rain, and bringeth forth the wind out of His treasures. Every man is brutish in his knowledge. Every founder is confounded by the graven image. For its molten image is falsehood, and there is no breath in them. They are vanity and the work of errors. In the time of their visitation they shall perish. The portion of Jacob is not like them, for he is the former of all things, and Israel is the rod of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is His name." And so that's our section we're going to be looking at tonight. And there's a lot of questions that are asked, and in these verses we're going to search out some answers as we go through these points. There's 10 things in our study we're looking for about contrasting God with the false gods. And in this, there's going to be some really relevant subject matter to our present situation, as God is talked about as the one who made the heavens, and He controls the waters, and He brings the lightnings, and ultimately, everything in creation is always under God's control. And so in a time like this, that can be very comforting to know that even though we see some horrible things that have taken place, we can know that ultimately God's in control, and He has a good purpose for all of this. But as we look at these verses, the first thing that we're asked to find is in verse 3 and in verse 8. There's a word we're going to be looking for there, and it's that idols are vain. Vain is the word we're looking for in verse 3 and 8. And it says, this comes from the Hebrew word habel, which literally means vapor or breath. Thus it signifies a vanity or a delusion. Idols are such because they are supposed to be powerful divine beings, when in fact, they're not even alive. So the first thing that Jeremiah lays out to Judah when he's calling them back to repentance from their idolatry was that the things they were worshiping were vain. And so in our second word we're going to be looking for is found in verse 3 also. And in verse 3, the word you're looking for there is tree. Because as Jeremiah lays out his case, he says that the idols are vanity. They're vain. But he says it's because idols are nothing more than a tree cut from the forest. And the man who worships an idol worships a lifeless tree, the crown of God's creation. Speaking of man, man is the chief thing in God's creation. He, after making man on the sixth day, he said his creation was very good. The crowning thing that God put in this earth, man, is reduced to worshiping a lifeless and mindless plant. And so this was the charge that Jeremiah was laying out to him, and why it was so bad, as we've talked about, because God's creation, the thing made on this earth to worship and glorify God, was reduced to worshiping literally a tree cut from the forest. So the third thing we're looking for is what Jeremiah had said about how these idols came to be, is in verse 3 also, and in verse 9. And the word you're looking for there is work. It says idols are nothing more than the work of man, a workman with an axe. Men refuse to worship the God who made them, and instead worship the gods they make themselves. And then Mr. Washer cites Romans chapter 1 because this is a very significant charge that Jeremiah brings against Judah here, because it's ultimately a big problem in our day today. You know, if you read Romans chapter 1, you're going to see a lot of things that are going on in our time, and it's a result of idolatry. I'd say one of the most obvious effects of idolatry in our day that we're seeing is men trying to redefine what truth is, men trying to redefine what knowledge is, men trying to redefine what a man and a woman is, men trying to redefine these boundaries that God has established. It's a form of idolatry. No, they don't always build up a tree and carve it into something and worship it, but they're trying to take down God's design and change it into something that they want. And we see in Romans 1, the verses that he cites here, 21 through 23, it says, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. And what's sad is, I know people, and y'all have probably seen them too, though. There's folks now that they're getting so degenerated in their minds that they want to act like animals. They want to act like beasts, and they want to even be identified as some kind of creature other than what God's made them to be. He's made them to be either a man or a woman. But either way, he's made them for himself. And it's just so sad when people take this route, when they see the creation and they worship it and not the one who made it. They don't serve God and they don't love God, but rather they do these things that ultimately cause them to be of a useless mind, to do things that don't make sense. You can't even reason with them. And what they're doing is they're serving and worshiping the work of their own hands, something that they've made up. When in reality, we have a great God to worship. And ultimately, since idolatry is built upon lies, it's built upon vanity, and it's built upon something that's not real, then the next thing that happens is it has to be dressed up. It has to look pretty. It has to be attractive, because in and of itself it ain't. So number 4, you're looking for the words silver and gold in verse 4 and in verse 9. Because it says idols are mere decorations of silver and gold. An idol is nothing more than a piece of wood, entirely without intrinsic splendor. For this reason, it must be decorated and adorned externally. But God's beauty and majesty are not a veneer, They are intrinsic or inherent. They emanate from who he really is. And this is what's sad about idolatry, as Jeremiah lays it out here, is being unthankful, like we read there in Romans, being unthankful, being dissatisfied with God, coveting and desiring a God of our own making to worship. This is what men have to do. We have to dress it up. We have to bring it out and put gold on it and silver and put something pretty on it, and we have to sell it to people. We have to make it look good. We have to bring up a different idea and say, well, this will be good for society, or this will be good for this, or this will be good for that. You have to turn evil into good. You have to dress it up and make it look nice. Because ultimately, idolatry, there's nothing beautiful in it. There's nothing inherent with an idol. It's just a piece of wood or a piece of metal, something that, given enough time and without the care of its worshipers, it'll die. I mean, it'll rot. It'll be corrupted. And just like the ideas that men bring up today, these philosophies of life and the way that politics shift and things go, they're just ideas of men. I mean, if you look back in history, you'll find a lot of these ideas have already been tried before. Men don't come up with anything new. Men just keep recycling the old stuff over and over again. Socialism's never worked. Communism's never worked. Humans are corrupt. And therefore, we need God to straighten us out. We need to look at him. We need to worship him, or else we'll just go down and down and down. We've seen it all throughout history. Societies get built up and societies fall. You have to keep your eyes on the Lord. You have to keep your eyes on him, worshiping the only God who sustains. And it's even wonderful because, like it says here, God has beauty in and of himself. I mean, every time I go back to the beginning of the Bible and I read that account of Genesis, and you hear about the beauty of all that before the fall, there's just there's an attraction in it, just to put yourself in your mind's eye, to go back there to that garden where Adam was, and to think about that. It says about the land of Havilah that there was gold and beryl and onyx, and you can just imagine all these beautiful gemstones up on the ground, and how pretty that place would have been. The river there, and every day would have been perfect. You'd have had perfect weather and sunshine, and any fruit you wanted was good to eat. You just go take it off and eat it. I mean, all the splendor of what that garden was, and unbroken fellowship with God. And what's wonderful for a Christian, though, we just keep our eyes on him. This world will try to sell you a whole lot of ideas. They'll be gilded over with gold, and they'll try to look nice, but they're only veneered. Because ultimately, God promises to those who worship him restored access to that tree of life. We'll go back to the paradise of God. Revelation tells us about a city, New Jerusalem, that comes down out of heaven, adorned as a bride for her husband. She's got all kinds of jewels all over, and she's beautiful. And God is the one who attracts us to himself. It's his beauty. All these things come from him, these beautiful things. The garden, New Jerusalem. I mean, and then all the wonderful things he gives us in our souls. Peace, love, joy, patience. I mean, all these wonderful things. God is beautiful. And then these idols, they have to be decorated. They have to be attractive to the eye, because otherwise, in and of themselves, there's no beauty in them. Which then we go down to the fifth thing. The word we're looking for is move. So not only are they fake, and not only are they not beautiful, and not only are they made by men in vain, but he says that they don't even move. Idols are fastened with nails, verse 4, so that they will not move, nor can they. It says that the word move comes from a Hebrew word, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that one, but it's a Hebrew word there written, P-U-Q is how it transliterates into English. But the Hebrew word here means to reel, wobble, or totter, so as to fall. But idols totter and fall over at the slightest nudge. But the one true God upholds the entire universe with the word of his power. And we find that in Hebrews chapter 1. But the false gods, the false ideologies, the false things of this world, they have no power. They don't have power to uphold. The wrong ideas and the wrong systems that men come up with, they don't uphold societies. Ultimately, they break them down. Men, in and of themselves, we can't even uphold ourselves, but what we tend downward. But God, if we look up to him and trust in him, to those who worship him, he's able to uphold us. He upholds the world around us because of His long-suffering, His patience. Even though men are so aggravating, even though men provoke God, He's long-suffering. He's long-suffering. We've got every reason to worship Him, and then you see such horrible blasphemies from men as they worship things that can't even compare, can't even come near to compare. And this is the closest we can get to a comparison, is just talk about how deficient they are in comparison with the living God. But number 6, we're looking for 2 words from verse 5. Speak and born. Speak and born. It said, idols speak not, and they must be born, because they cannot go. Idols are mute and lame. Even wicked men can boast about power that they do not possess, but idols can't even vainly boast. The fact that idols must be carried demonstrates their impotence and uselessness. But our God is omnipotent. Idols, false gods, they have no real power. They have no real power, but God has all power. As we've looked at already, He upholds the entire universe with His words. And I like how Mr. Washer points out the fact that a false god can't even do what a man could do. I mean, big old Goliath could stand out there in the middle of the field and he could blaspheme towards God. He had more power than an idol. An idol can't even vainly boast of its own strength. Men can even at least do that. But it says here, the true God carries His people. And he cites Deuteronomy 1:31, and I just took a piece of that verse here because part he's talking about in quotes. He says, the Lord thy God bear thee, as a man doeth bear his son. And that's the image that we get from the Scriptures, the tender care of God, that He picks us up like His own child and carries us along through life. And yet idols have to be borne on men's shoulders. He also cites Deuteronomy 32:11, and I want to read it to you because this has become one of my favorite chapters in all the Bible, is Deuteronomy 32. If you ever just need some encouragement, go read Deuteronomy 32. But it says in verse 11, it says, as an eagle. Just listen to this picture that God gives us of Himself. As an eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, spreadeth abroad her wings, taketh them, beareth them on her wings. That's the way God wants us to remember. That's what He's doing for us. That's what He's doing for those who worship Him. Idols ain't doing a thing for their worshipers, but our God, He picks us up. He stirs us up. He flutters over us. He broods over us and watches over and carries us and bears us up. Much, much to be thankful for there, for what the Lord does for us. And in verse 7, we see that idols, in relation to having no power to move, speak, or even support themselves, verse 5 tells us 2 words we're looking for there, evil and good. Evil and good. It's because idols cannot do evil, neither can they do good. It says, for this reason idols are neither to be feared for the punishment that their devotees pretend that they can inflict, nor to be adored and thankful and thanked for the good that is wrongly attributed to them. You know, Jesus even told us that God is so merciful and so gracious that He even sends rain on the evil and the unthankful, just like He sends it on those who are looking for it and thank Him for it. And yet it's sad that around the world, men who do worship false gods, even men who are evil and unthankful, they'll attribute the rain to natural processes. They'll attribute thanks to the rain to their own false gods. But in reality, Jesus already told us what's going on. God sends that rain because He's gracious. He does it to take care of His own, but He also does it for their sake, that they might eat something, that they might have crops in their field, even though they're unthankful towards Him, or they'll attribute it to a wrong source. It just shows in the end how good God is, how gracious God is. Idols cannot do anything. They can't do evil, and they can't even do good. So our God, He certainly can do good, though. I wanted to give you one example from the book of Judges, and I thought highlighted this. I'll sum up the story here just real quick. Gideon, you know the story, he was called upon to be a leader over Israel. And the first thing that God assigned him to do was to go in chapter 6 and tear down this idol that was in his father's place there. And he tore it down. He tore it down at night. And in the morning, verse 31 of chapter 6 of Judges, in the morning they went out and saw that that idol had been torn down. And a part of that verse there said, if he be a God, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. Now we've seen that God can do good. We know that God can do good. But God can also bring about calamities. He can also bring about punishment. See, we should not fear the false gods. We should not fear the ideas and the powers that be in this world, because ultimately no power can stand against God. God here can speak for himself. This false god, Baal here, he couldn't defend himself. He never did anything. Gideon didn't suffer any punishment because Gideon tore down a false idol. But his God had come and talked to him beforehand. His God was with him, and God used Gideon for his own glory, because God can and does do good, and God can also bring about vengeance. Isaiah 45:7, the Lord had declared, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. And evil there meaning in the sense of punishment and calamity. But he says, I, the Lord, do all these things. And in Romans 12:19, the Lord declares, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So while we should never fear the persecution of men, we should never fear liberal agendas that rise up against God, we should never fear false religions and their threats made against us. Because ultimately, the worst that men can do, Jesus told us this. He said, what can they do? They can kill the body, and they can't do any more. He said, but fear him. Fear him. Fear God, who has power to bring about vengeance. God, who can actually move. God who can speak. God who can rebuke. God who can make good on his threats, and he can bless. And he can also curse. God's promised that. He'll bless those who love him, and those who hate him will receive his curse. But then in number 8, we're looking at verse 14. Number 8, we're looking at verse 14. And we're looking for falsehood. Falsehood and breath in verse 14. Because idols are falsehood, and there is no breath in them. So the word falsehood here is translated from the Hebrew word shakir, which means deception, disappointment, falsehood or lie. An idol that has no breath cannot give life to men, but the true and living God gives life and breath to all. He cites Job there. But for this reason, everything that has breath should praise the Lord. Psalm 150, verse 6. And I thought about Loretta when I read this verse, when I was reading this section here of the study. And she sings that song, we were born to serve the Lord. I was born to serve the Lord. And he cites here in Psalm 150, verse 6, that's the purpose. God is alive, and God has imparted life to men. God puts his breath within us for the purpose of singing praises unto him. Everything that has breath has been given breath by the one who gives it. We didn't get it on our own. It's a gift to us. The ability to draw air tonight is a gift from God. We were born to serve the Lord, she sings in that song. And she says in that song, my eyes were made to read God's word. And I thought how this can go even farther beyond. God is so good to us that he gives us physical life. He gives us eyes and ears and mouths and the ability to breathe. He gives us hands and feet that we can move and and work and serve Him with the bodies that He's given us. We have all these blessings from the Lord that He's given us because He Himself does have life in Him. We're made by Him and we were made for Him. All believers are not our own. We were bought even. God made us in the beginning and we fell into sin. And being dead in trespasses and sins, He bought us back. His Son gave His own life to buy us back, to redeem us back to God, to give us life and life more abundant. He's done all of this. He made us in the beginning to serve Him and to love Him and to use the breath that He gave us to praise Him. And having fallen into sin, God was so merciful that He gave His Son to die for us, to bring us back to life for that same purpose, to restore us to the purpose of living for Him and serving Him. That's why it's such a horrible offense when one goes after a false idol, when one refuses God and would rather worship themselves, their money, even in parts of the world, physical idols. It's such a horrible offense because of how much God has given to men. And at the end of the day, at the end of time, as we read over there in Romans chapter 1, that was God's declaration that men have no excuses. If we have the ability to discern this creation, God will hold us accountable for knowing that He is God. And if He's given us all these gifts, communicated to us His own image, eyes, ears, breath, that we might praise Him, hands and feet that we might live out a life of service to Him. If He's given us all this, He's going to hold us accountable for it at the end. That's why it's important. It's important that we look to the true God, that we look to the living God, that we come to His Word, that we come to it and that we pray that His Spirit would fill us, that He would breathe into us and help us to know His Word, to know His ways, and to serve Him in a right way. Now for the Christian, Christ has purchased our redemption. For the one who believes, you are brought back to God, you are justified. And you can always rejoice in that your record is clear, that Christ has regarded our helpless estate and shed His own blood for our soul, as the song says. That not part of my sin, but the whole of it was nailed to His cross. So a Christian, a believer in Christ, is redeemed to God. But we do, even as Christians, we're going to have to stand and give account for all the gifts and all the things that He's given us to serve Him with. We need to be able to have good consciences when we lay down at night, knowing that during that day I strove to serve. I was striving to serve the Lord as best I could. But remember, He's merciful. He's merciful. He wants to help us. He's for us. He's not against us. So we can call on Him. These vain idols, they don't show men the right way. They don't even have power to help them. But our God says that He can work in us, both to will and to do of His good pleasure. He breathes into us through this word right here. And we ought to spend much time worshiping Him by studying it. And then point 9 is in verse 15. We come back to the word vanity. The word vanity is mentioned again. It says idols are vanity. And then we've got our same Hebrew word there, habel, meaning vapor or breath. It says, thus it denotes something that is vain or worthless, a delusion. And ultimately, Jesus asked that question to men, what will you give in exchange for your soul? If we gained all this world, all of its idols, its riches, its gold, its silver, everything you could possibly get in this world, and you get to the highest point and you lose your own soul. It's like the idols. It's just vanity and it's worthless. You can hear Solomon in Ecclesiastes preach all about that. Vanities, vanities. All of it's vanity, says the preacher. And that's what the things of this world are. The things that men make idols out of, they're worthless. They're delusions. And then their last one here, number 10. It says idols are, in verse 15, work of errors that will perish under the judgment of God. It says the word errors is translated from the Hebrew word tatuim. there are two possible meanings for this word. And it says, one, that idols are mere objects to be mocked. And obviously we see that bear out in Scripture, because God does mock the false idols, and he actually takes pleasure in it. And Elijah even, there's an example there where Elijah was actually taking pleasure in mocking the false Baal, who had no power to bring down fire from heaven. And then number two, the meaning can also be for this word that they are delusions to those who trust in them. So it's meaning that they merely exist. They're a figment of the imagination. They merely have no more power than what the worshipers of them ascribe to them. But both ideas are true, and we see it borne out in Scripture that, to some who have weak consciences, an idol may be esteemed as something, but we know that God is God, and there is no else. So idols are vain. To sum up here, idols are vain. They are made of elements created. They are made by men. They are decorated with ornaments. They cannot move. They cannot speak. They cannot bless or curse. They are false, with no breath or life. They are worthless, and they're delusions, and they're objects of mocking. And so the next question we're asked here is in verse 8 and in verse 14. And it says, how are idolaters, namely those who trust in and reverence idols, described in this passage? And to read both places, it's a similar description. Both in verse 8 and 14, it's brutish and foolish. That's how God looks down at men who serve idols, men who do not worship him, men who go about their own ways, serving their own figments of their imagination. It's foolish and it's brutish. And it even says in verse 14, the word confounded, that they'll be confounded there. And I thought, what a great contrast. Because for a Christian, 1 Peter 2:6 says, and he that believeth on him, that is Jesus Christ, shall not be confounded. We have that wonderful promise that our God, in the end, one who worships and serves him, will not be put to shame, not be confounded. Because our God is true, and he's able to bring about all those things that we believe him for, those things that we're trusting in him for, those things that he has said that he will do, that we read in his word. And when we trust him and live our lives in accordance with that, we will not be ashamed. All those who put their trust in false idols, all those who put their trust in themselves, they will be ashamed when they stand before God. They'll have no covering. They'll have no wedding garment, and they'll be cast out. But not the Christian, not one who trusts in the living God. You won't be confounded. Our study note for brutish here says that the word brutish comes from the word ba'ar, which may also be translated as stupid or senseless. It says the word foolish comes from the Hebrew word kasal, which may also be translated as stupid. Both words are harsh but true descriptions of men who worship, serve, and care for lifeless idols that have been made with their own hands. Our other study note there says that, again, that the word brutish comes from the word ba'ar. Those who worship idols are without knowledge, they're void of knowledge, and aloof from knowledge. They're ignorant of truth and have little grasp upon reality. And so knowing that men who do not worship the true and living God, men who have no knowledge of the Holy One, when we meet people who don't know God, when we meet people who don't know the gospel, when we meet people who are living their lives in sin and away from God, we need to remember that this is the position that they're in. Whether it sounds harsh or not, it's what God's judgment against men is that men who don't worship him, men who don't acknowledge God, men who go after false idols, God says they're foolish and they're brutish. They lack knowledge. They lack knowledge. And the most compassionate thing we can do is to put our arm around them and find a way, some way to teach them, to lead them in the right direction and away from their wrong ideologies. But we need to do it in love, because that's what our God did for us. He didn't come down and beat us in the head with a stick and tell us how bad we messed everything up. He does come down and tell us where we've done wrong. He does give his 10 commandments, and he does show us how bad we've messed up, but he done it in love. He came down and he lived an example on this earth in the person of Christ, and he showed us what it is to love our neighbor. And then he laid his own life down on the cross to bring us back to God. He did it in love. And so we ought to follow after our living God. Our God that's so alive, that's so true, that He actually came down not as a lifeless idol, not as just something sitting up in a house somewhere that had to be nailed down. No, He came as a living, breathing man. He talked to us and He walked with us. Our God. He's the true and living God. But it says here, how is the true and living God? How is the true and living God of the Scriptures described in the following verses? How is He contrasted with the idols and false gods of men? And we've looked at a few things, but here are these last 3 points here. Verses 6 and 7, verse 10, and verse 12 and 13. We're just going to kind of read through what the Bible says in these verses right here, and just listen as how God is described in contrast. So we've seen all this bad and all this vainness and all this lifelessness, all of these worthless attributes of idols, but here's God described. It says God is described as holy, like no other. He's described as the Lord, great, mighty, and as having a great name. He's described as being worthy of reverential fear by all creatures. He's described as the King of the nations. God's also described as the most wise out of all creation. His wisdom is perfect, divine, and holy. In contrast, the false gods and the worshipers of them are foolish. But verse 10 says that the Lord is true. The Lord is God, the living God. He's the everlasting King. His wrath is not vain nor powerless, but is real and powerful enough to cause the earth to tremble. And then in verse 12 through 13, it says, God is omnipotent. He's made the earth. God's wise, and He established the earth by His wisdom. You can see Proverbs 8 for more detail on that. But it says God made the heavens according to His own will and understanding, His discretion. God decreed the seas and the waters above the heavens. God causes the rain cycles to happen. God decrees storms, lightnings, and winds obey His voice. And when He came down to talk to us, when He came down to walk among us, He proved that. And He stilled storms. He's the one in control. So I'll leave you with 2 verses I just want to read from Deuteronomy that I think sum up really this whole lesson of the picture that we need to remember about our God. Deuteronomy 7, 9 and 10 says, Know, therefore, that the Lord thy God, He is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love Him, and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations, and repaying them that hate Him to their face, to destroy them. He will not be slack to him that hateth Him. He will repay him to his face.